It was supposed to be an ordinary Sunday night in Brentwood, the kind of quiet evening where the only sounds are the soft hum of the city outside and the faint rustle of leaves in a meticulously maintained garden. But for the Reiner family, ordinary had been obliterated, shattered in the most unimaginable way. By the time the first sirens wailed through the pristine streets, 2 lives had already ended in a brutal act that would grip the nation's attention, not just for its violence, but for the deep, chilling betrayal that seemed to hang over the entire family. The Reiners were not just any family. They were prominent, wealthy, and known in circles of influence. And yet, wealth and status could not shield them from the horrors that had unfolded behind the gates of their $13.5 million Brentwood estate. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. At 78, Rob Reiner had lived a life many would envy, surrounded by family, legacy, and the quiet prestige of accomplishment. His wife, Michelle, 70, had spent decades as the silent pillar of their household, managing their home, supporting her children, and providing stability. Their lives, from the outside, looked serene, enviable even. But appearances, as often they do, can be deceiving. The night of December 14th, the night that would mark an end to the life of their 32-year-old son Nick Reiner, would expose just how fragile even the most seemingly perfect lives can be. Nick, the son living in the guest house of the sprawling estate, had become a figure of intense scrutiny, a young man whose life was now overshadowed by tragedy and suspicion. That night, according to official reports, he would be arrested, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. His parents lay lifeless, stabbed in what authorities described as multiple sharp force injuries, and the manner of death was ruled homicide. The details are harrowing, almost cinematic in their horror, yet painfully real. But how does a family tragedy escalate to such extremity? How could a son end up implicated in the murder of the very parents who nurtured him? And why, when Romy Reiner, the 27-year-old daughter, discovered the scene, did she immediately hint to authorities about a dangerous family member, a warning that would soon become a cornerstone of the investigation? Imagine standing in her shoes for a moment. You walk through a door expecting an evening of quiet, perhaps planning a small family dinner, or simply to enjoy the comforts of home. Instead, you encounter a scene that freezes time. Panic, disbelief, the horror of realizing that 2 people you love unconditionally are gone, and that someone close, someone who shares your blood, might be responsible. Her voice, trembling as she recounted what she saw to the police, became one of the first fragments of truth that the world would cling to amid the swirling speculation. Her warning about the dangerous family member would ignite media frenzy, social media debates, and countless conspiracy theories. But the reality behind those words was far more complex, far more disturbing than anyone could have anticipated. The public, of course, was immediately captivated. It's hard to ignore a story that combines wealth, fame-adjacent status, and shocking violence. In a society increasingly obsessed with true crime, the narrative practically writes itself: a wealthy family, a sprawling mansion, a night of murder, and a young man accused of killing his own parents. The headlines were instantaneous. Social media exploded with comments ranging from sympathetic to speculative. Friends, acquaintances, and strangers alike poured over every detail, desperate for insight into what could have possibly gone wrong in a household that, from the outside, seemed idyllic. But beneath the polished exterior of manicured lawns and tasteful decor lay a web of tension, secrets, and perhaps unresolved conflicts that would soon become the focus of intense scrutiny. One of the most haunting aspects of this story is its timing. The Reiner family, despite public perception, had internal dynamics that were rarely discussed outside of private conversations. Reports suggest that Nick had lived in the guest house, a somewhat separate but still connected part of the estate. In many ways, he was physically close yet emotionally distant, a circumstance that may have amplified the tensions that night. Was he struggling with personal demons? Was there a simmering resentment that had been ignored or underestimated by those around him? And Romy's revelation to authorities that a dangerous family member should be considered a suspect was a chilling suggestion that someone in the family might have harbored lethal intent. The idea is almost unfathomable. The notion that danger could come not from outside forces, but from within the very circle of trust meant to protect. As authorities pieced together the events, the official timeline began to emerge, each detail more unsettling than the last. The bodies of Rob and Michelle were discovered on the property, Nick arrested that very night, and the media coverage went into overdrive. Rumors, conflicting reports, and speculation quickly filled the vacuum of verified information. What really happened in the hours leading up to the tragedy? What was Nick doing in those final moments before the police arrived? And, perhaps most hauntingly, how had the relationships within the Reiner household evolved over the years to allow for such a catastrophic event to occur? To understand the depth of this tragedy, one must also consider the psychological and emotional layers at play. Families, no matter how affluent or outwardly stable, carry complex dynamics. Sibling rivalries, unspoken resentments, mental health struggles, and past grievances can fester in silence until a critical breaking point is reached. In the case of the Reiners, it seems that night's horror may have been the culmination of factors both hidden and visible. But uncovering them requires a careful examination of the family's history, their interactions, and the environment in which these tensions had been quietly building. And that is exactly what we are about to do. From this point, the story unfolds like a dark, intricate tapestry. Every thread, from Nick's life and his relationship with his parents to Romy's shocking discovery and the reactions of law enforcement, contributes to a broader narrative of suspense, betrayal, and human tragedy. Each revelation leads to another question, and every answer opens the door to deeper mysteries. What seemed like a single act of violence becomes a lens through which we explore human behavior, familial loyalty, and the fragility of trust. And yet, even as the investigation progressed, the public remained captivated not only by the crime itself, but by the enigmatic figure of Nick Reiner. Who was he? What motivated him? Could anyone have predicted that this family, wealthy and seemingly secure, would experience such devastation? And, most pressingly, what will come next as the case moves through the courts, as new evidence emerges, and as the world continues to grapple with the shocking nature of this tragedy? By the end of this story, you may find yourself questioning everything you thought you knew about family, loyalty, and the thin line between love and violence. And it all begins with that fateful night in Brentwood, a night that no one involved could ever forget. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The night started like any other, the kind of evening where shadows stretch lazily across the manicured lawns, and the quiet hum of a wealthy neighborhood lulls residents into a false sense of security. Brentwood, with its wide streets, luxury homes, and pristine facades, is a place where people expect calm, not chaos. But on Sunday, December 14th, 2025, that calm was shattered forever in the Reiner household. Rob Reiner, 78, had spent the day in what seemed like normal routine. Reading, answering emails, checking in with friends, and perhaps reflecting on a life filled with achievement. Michelle, 70, his wife, had moved through the estate's halls with a quiet efficiency, preparing dinner, organizing the household, and tending to the details that come with running a home of such magnitude. Their lives were outwardly serene, the image of stability. But in reality, the veneer of perfection was fragile, and it was about to crack violently. The first indications that something was wrong came not from the parents, but from within the guest house. Nick Reiner, their 32-year-old son, had been living separately but close enough to remain under his parents' watchful eyes. Whether Nick's presence that night was accidental, intentional, or premeditated remains a question that haunts investigators. Sources indicate that tensions had been simmering for months, perhaps years, but the exact trigger for what would happen that night is still murky. Around evening, Romy Reiner, the couple's 27-year-old daughter, arrived at the estate. She had been away, likely visiting friends or tending to her own commitments, and returned to a home that would soon reveal unimaginable horror. When she approached the main house, she was met with silence, a silence too heavy to be ordinary. It was the kind of quiet that raises the hair on the back of your neck, the sort of stillness that hints at disaster. She moved toward the house, expecting perhaps to hear laughter, the clink of dishes, or a casual greeting. Instead, what she encountered would haunt her forever. As Romy opened the door, the first thing she saw were the bodies of her parents. The scene was so stark, so violently out of place in a home she had known all her life, that it froze her in her tracks. Rob and Michelle lay in positions suggesting a struggle, the evidence pointing toward multiple sharp force injuries. The official reports would later label the manner of death as homicide, but in that moment, Romy didn't think in forensic terms. She thought in raw, unfiltered panic. The horror of seeing the people you love most, lifeless and violated, is beyond comprehension. Immediately, Romy called the authorities. Her voice, trembling and urgent, conveyed the gravity of the situation. She warned them not only about what she had seen, but about the possibility of a dangerous family member, a comment that would prove both prescient and haunting. What did she mean? Who could possibly be capable of such an act within their own family? These questions were being asked not just by investigators, but by the public, who would later dissect every word she spoke. By the time the first responders arrived, the night had already taken on a surreal, almost cinematic quality. Police cars lined the estate, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows across the mansion's immaculate lawns. Detectives moved quickly, securing the scene, taking statements, and beginning the grim task of piecing together the chain of events. The evidence was stark, bloody, and undeniable. And yet, even in the face of this horror, certain questions lingered. How did this happen? Why was Nick Reiner implicated so quickly? And what had been brewing under the surface of the Reiner household that could culminate in such violence? Nick's arrest that same night shocked everyone. The young man, who had lived in proximity to his parents yet maintained a degree of separation, was suddenly the center of a maelstrom. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, an accusation that would forever alter the trajectory of his life and the narrative surrounding the Reiner family. In the legal sense, he was presumed innocent until proven guilty, but in the court of public opinion, the story was already being written, filled with speculation, rumors, and theories about motives and mental state. What made this night particularly chilling is the combination of familiarity and betrayal. Families are supposed to be safe havens, the places where we feel most secure. Yet, in this case, the threat did not come from outside. It came from within. The idea that a son could be responsible for the deaths of his own parents is almost impossible to comprehend. It challenges fundamental notions of trust, loyalty, and the very structure of family itself. And as investigators sifted through the scene, every detail seemed to hint at a complex, tangled web of emotions, relationships, and perhaps unspoken grievances that had escalated to violence. The timeline of the night remains partially unclear, but certain events are verified. The murders occurred on the evening of December 14th. Romy discovered the bodies shortly thereafter. Nick was arrested later that night. Authorities reported the cause of death as multiple sharp force injuries, the manner as homicide. But these facts, though precise, only scratch the surface. Beneath them lies a story of tension, fear, and possibly premeditation, a story that the world is still trying to understand. The media quickly caught wind of the incident, and social media erupted with speculation. Headlines emphasized the shocking nature of the crime, often using the family's prominence and wealth to amplify the story. Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok became arenas for debate, with users dissecting every known detail and theorizing about motives, mental health issues, and family dynamics. Yet, despite the widespread attention, the most intimate details, the psychological, emotional, and relational factors that could explain the tragedy, remained behind closed doors, accessible only to those with knowledge of the family's private life. One of the most striking aspects of this night is Romy's warning about a dangerous family member. Whether this referred to Nick or someone else is unclear, but the comment indicated that there was an awareness of risk, a recognition that someone within the family had the potential to cause harm. It's a chilling thought. A child aware enough to alert authorities, yet powerless to prevent the catastrophe that would unfold. This detail adds layers to the story, raising questions about foresight, accountability, and the silent warning signs that may have been missed or ignored. As the night unfolded, investigators were left with a scene of unimaginable violence and a young man in custody, whose presence in the guest house and proximity to the crime scene made him the prime suspect. For the family, The night represented not just loss, but the unraveling of a carefully maintained world. For the investigators, it was the beginning of a complex case that would challenge even seasoned professionals. And for the public, it was a story that combined shock, mystery, and the ultimate betrayal. The idea that danger can exist where it is least expected among those we trust most. In trying to understand the gravity of that night, one must consider not only the immediate events, but also the broader context. The Reiner family's history, their interpersonal dynamics, and the possible pressures that had been mounting behind the walls of their estate. Wealth and privilege do not immunize against human flaws, and in this case, they may have amplified them. The world watches as investigators delve into motives, mental states, and the chain of events leading up to the tragedy. But no amount of reporting can fully capture the emotional weight of a daughter discovering her parents dead, the community grappling with a shocking crime, or the family attempting to navigate a loss so profound it defies comprehension. And yet, even amid the horror and confusion, certain details stand out. The Reiner's daughter, Romy, became a crucial witness, her testimony providing the first glimpse into the psychological undercurrents that may have played a role. Nick's immediate arrest, while necessary for procedural reasons, cast a long shadow of suspicion and speculation. And the sheer violence of the murders, described as multiple sharp force injuries, underscores the intensity and brutality of the act. Each fact adds to a narrative that is as disturbing as it is compelling, a narrative that will continue to unfold as the investigation proceeds. But what happened next? The actions, revelations, and secrets uncovered in the immediate aftermath would change everything. It was only the beginning, a prelude to a story far more intricate and horrifying than a single night's tragedy. As law enforcement, the media, and the family itself moved forward, new details emerged, each adding complexity and tension. The night of December 14th was over, but the story of the Reiners was only beginning. And as we peel back the layers of this case, each discovery brings us closer to understanding not just the crime itself, but the human elements that made it possible. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Nick Reiner. The name alone had begun to dominate headlines, social media feeds, and water cooler conversations across the country. 32 years old, living in the guest house of his parents' $13.5 million Brentwood estate, and now thrust into the center of one of the most shocking family tragedies in recent memory. To the world, he was a suspect, accused of killing the two people who brought him into existence. But to understand the story fully, one must step beyond the headlines, beyond the sensationalism, and examine the man himself. Who he was, how he lived, and what might have led to that fateful night on December 14th. Nick's upbringing was, by all outward appearances, a picture of privilege and opportunity. Growing up as the son of Rob and Michelle Reiner, he had access to the best education, comfortable surroundings, and all the advantages a wealthy family could provide. But wealth does not always equal happiness. Privilege can sometimes mask underlying tensions, emotional struggles, or feelings of isolation. While the outside world saw the Reiner family as accomplished, close-knit, and successful, the reality behind the walls of their estate may have been more complicated. Those who knew Nick described him as intelligent, perceptive, and quiet, though not without his contradictions. He was a son who appeared to be engaged with the family, yet maintained a distance. Living in the guest house provided him with proximity to his parents while also allowing for autonomy. Some have speculated that this physical separation mirrored emotional separation, a boundary that may have been self-imposed or suggested by the family dynamics themselves. Sources suggest that Nick struggled at times to reconcile his personal ambitions with the expectations of his parents. In families with power, wealth, and influence, there is often a subtle but intense pressure to perform, succeed, or conform to a particular image. How much of this played into the tragedy is a question that investigators and psychologists alike are grappling with. The night of the murders, Nick's presence in the guest house becomes pivotal. Was he there by coincidence, by design, or by compulsion? Reports indicate that he was living on the property, which naturally makes him a key figure in understanding what unfolded. But beyond the logistics of proximity, there is the psychological weight. The son accused of killing the very parents who had nurtured him. The mind reels at the contradiction. How does one reconcile the love, guidance, and upbringing provided by parents with the actions attributed to their child? The answer is anything but simple. Friends and acquaintances have painted a picture of a young man who could be both charming and withdrawn, socially adept, yet privately introspective. Some suggest that Nick had been grappling with personal issues, stress, frustration, perhaps unresolved anger or resentment, but concrete details remain scarce. The tragedy forces a larger question upon anyone observing from the outside. How well do we really know the people closest to us? Even the people we live with, share meals with, and see daily may harbor inner conflicts and emotional struggles that remain invisible until a breaking point is reached. Investigators have noted that Nick's prior behavior, though largely unremarkable, did not provide clear warning signs. There were no public records indicating violent tendencies, no official complaints, no arrests prior to this night. Yet, in retrospect, some family members and insiders hint at tension. Perhaps there were arguments, disagreements, or subtle signs that something was amiss. The human mind is adept at normalizing small conflicts, at ignoring behaviors that seem out of place, until they accumulate into something unmanageable. And while speculation cannot replace facts, it is often these small, overlooked moments that can illuminate the conditions leading to catastrophe. The arrest of Nick that same night was swift and decisive. Authorities, responding to Romy's report and the evidence at the scene, determined that he was the prime suspect. He was taken into custody, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, and moved into the complex world of legal scrutiny. To the public, this arrest painted a stark narrative. The son, living under the same roof as his victims, accused of an unspeakable act. But behind the headlines is a far more nuanced and troubling picture, one that involves familial expectations, personal frustrations, and the psychological pressures of growing up in a household where wealth and status may have masked deeper struggles. Consider, for a moment, the emotional landscape Nick might have inhabited. A young man in his early 30s, living in a separate space on the same property as his parents, likely navigating the tensions of independence versus familial loyalty. Was there resentment, small, simmering, persistent, or was this a momentary lapse that escalated uncontrollably? Psychological experts often point to the phenomenon of cumulative stress. When small frustrations build over time, even minor incidents can trigger disproportionate reactions. Could that have been a factor here? The evidence is incomplete, but it is a critical piece of understanding the human side of the tragedy. It is also essential to consider the public perception versus the private reality. In the media, Nick Reiner is a suspect, a figure framed by accusations and speculation. But in private circles, he was a son, a brother, a young man with hopes, fears, and a life shaped by complex family dynamics. This duality is part of what makes cases like this so compelling and so disturbing. It forces us to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that someone's outward persona can differ dramatically from their private behavior, and that even the most seemingly loving families can harbor unresolved tensions capable of erupting into violence. Nick's relationships with his parents have been described as respectful, but not always close. Some insiders suggest there were frequent disagreements about lifestyle choices, career paths, or personal decisions. These disagreements, if left unaddressed, can accumulate silently, creating a foundation of unresolved conflict. In families where status and reputation are paramount, these conflicts may be downplayed, ignored, or hidden, leaving only the simmering frustration to grow unchecked. On the night of December 14th, it appears that something within this dynamic reached a breaking point, culminating in a tragedy that no one could have fully anticipated. The media coverage of Nick's arrest and the murders also adds layers of complexity. Headlines emphasize drama, speculation, and shock, often overlooking the subtleties of human behavior that could provide context. Social media, meanwhile, amplifies rumors and conjecture, creating a climate where fact and fiction blur. In this environment, Nick's identity becomes not only that of a suspect, but also a symbol of the ultimate familial betrayal. The public fascination is understandable. There is a primal horror in imagining a son taking the lives of his own parents. but it also obscures the deeper questions about motive, mental state, and family dynamics that are essential to understanding the tragedy fully. As investigators continue to examine the scene, interview witnesses, and collect evidence, they are tasked with unraveling not just a criminal act, but a complex web of relationships, emotions, and psychological pressures. Nick Reiner, in this context, is both central and enigmatic. Every decision he made leading up to that night, every interaction with his parents, every moment of tension, becomes a potential clue to understanding why this tragedy occurred. And yet, even with exhaustive investigation, certain aspects may remain unknowable, leaving questions that challenge our understanding of family, loyalty, and human behavior. One of the most haunting aspects of this story is the duality of Nick's position. He is both a son and a suspect, a young man who had access, familiarity, and presumably love for the people he is accused of killing. The tension between these identities is stark and almost impossible to reconcile. How does someone reconcile affection for parents with the alleged actions that night? And how does the family, the community, and the legal system navigate the intersection of love, betrayal, and justice? These are the questions that make this story so compelling and so tragic. Even as the investigation unfolds, Nick's presence in the narrative remains a focal point. Every detail of his life, the physical proximity to the scene, his personal history, his interactions with family members, is scrutinized. Psychologists, legal experts, and true crime commentators weigh in, trying to provide insight into a situation that seems almost surreal. And for the Reiner family, the public, and Nick himself, the consequences of that night will reverberate for years to come. Ultimately, understanding Nick Reiner is crucial to understanding the tragedy as a whole. He is not merely a suspect in a sensational story. He is a human being enmeshed in complex family dynamics, personal struggles, and a night that would change everything. The combination of proximity, opportunity, and unresolved tension may have created conditions for a catastrophe that, while shocking, was not entirely unforeseeable in retrospect. Yet, the full truth remains elusive, waiting to be uncovered through careful examination of events, motivations, and the human psyche. As we move forward into the deeper layers of the Reiner family story, it becomes clear that Nick Reiner's life, his actions, and his relationships are central to understanding the entire tragedy. Every revelation about him adds to the tapestry of suspense, betrayal, and human complexity. And as the story unfolds, one question looms larger than any other. What drove a son to the edge of committing the unthinkable, and what secrets remain hidden behind the walls of the Reiner estate? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Families are complicated. Even the ones that look perfect on the outside, with sprawling estates, polite smiles, and public appearances of harmony, often hide layers of tension that can simmer quietly for years. The Reiner family was no exception. Behind the pristine facade of their $13.5 million Brentwood estate, there were undercurrents, unspoken resentments, subtle rivalries, and personal struggles that would help set the stage for a tragedy so extreme it would capture national attention. Understanding these dynamics is essential because while the events of December 14th shocked the world, they did not occur in a vacuum. Every relationship, every disagreement, every quiet moment of tension in that house contributed to the story that unfolded that night. Rob Reiner, 78, was a figure of authority in the household, a patriarch whose presence dominated both the public and private spheres. Known for his accomplishments and poised demeanor, he was both revered and, at times, intimidating within his family. His wife, Michelle, 70, played a different role. She was the quiet anchor, managing the family's daily life, maintaining order, and attempting to mediate conflicts that arose between children or between parent and child. To outsiders, this might have seemed idyllic, a family of wealth, stature, and sophistication, but family insiders suggest that tension was never far beneath the surface. Nick Reiner, the 32-year-old son living in the guest house, occupied a complicated space in this household. Physically close yet emotionally distant, he maintained independence while remaining tethered to the family's expectations. His relationship with Rob and Michelle was layered with affection, frustration, and, According to some sources, occasional conflict. While no public record shows overt disputes escalating into violence before December 14th, there were hints, subtle, easily overlooked, that tension existed. These could have been disagreements over lifestyle choices, expectations, or even the pressure of living in a household where wealth and appearances carried weight. Rob Reiner, the 27-year-old daughter, adds another layer to the family dynamic. She discovered the bodies that night, but her role in the family had always been complex. She seemed closer to her parents in some ways, perhaps more attuned to the household's inner workings. Her warnings to authorities about a dangerous family member hint at an awareness of underlying threats, an understanding of tensions that may have been invisible to outsiders. Her perspective is crucial for interpreting what happened. She was both witness and participant, someone who had seen enough to recognize potential danger before the tragedy struck. The parents themselves, Rob and Michelle, were not immune to conflict. In families, disagreements over finances, career paths, and personal decisions are normal, but in the Reiner household, these disagreements could carry heavier emotional weight due to the family's public image and wealth. Tensions that might be minor in other households could feel magnified in an environment where appearances are paramount, and mistakes carry both private and public consequences. Understanding these pressures is essential to understanding the psychological landscape that night. From reports, there were occasional signs of friction between Nick and his parents. Whether it was disagreement over his career, his living arrangements, or his personal choices, these tensions likely contributed to the atmosphere within the estate. Every family has disagreements. What makes this case extraordinary is how these disagreements, real or perceived, may have escalated to a point of crisis. Experts often note that in families with significant wealth or status, the combination of high expectations and internalized pressure can create a psychological pressure cooker. A seemingly minor conflict can snowball if underlying grievances are not addressed, and the result can be devastating. The structure of the estate itself is also worth noting. Nick's residence in the guest house was both a literal and metaphorical separation from the main household. While proximity allowed for oversight, it also provided privacy. This physical separation may have allowed tensions to fester without intervention, creating an environment where unresolved conflicts could escalate unchecked. Families often underestimate the significance of physical space in managing relationships. In this case, the guest house may have been both a refuge and a stage for the events that would unfold. Romi's role as the observer and intermediary in the family is also critical. Her awareness of potential danger suggests a perceptiveness about the family dynamics that perhaps no one else recognized. The fact that she immediately flagged a dangerous family member points to prior knowledge or at least a heightened sense of caution. This moment underscores the complexity of the Reiner household. Danger was not a distant concept. It was recognized, even if it wasn't fully understood. Another factor in family dynamics is communication or the lack thereof. In households with wealth, influence, or prominence, communication can often be performative rather than genuine. Children may fear disappointing parents. Parents may avoid conflict to maintain appearances, and underlying grievances remain unspoken. This creates an environment where emotions simmer, misunderstandings multiply, and the potential for explosive situations grows. In the Reiner family, evidence suggests that communication may have been strained, particularly between Nick and his parents. The consequences of this breakdown would become tragically evident. Outside perspectives also contribute to understanding the family dynamics. Friends and acquaintances describe Nick as private, sometimes withdrawn, and occasionally at odds with his family's expectations. These traits are not uncommon among young adults navigating independence, but within the context of a household charged with wealth, authority, and unspoken rules, they could create friction. Similarly, Romi's awareness of potential danger suggests she had insights into these dynamics that outsiders might never perceive. Every individual in the family held pieces of the puzzle, and it was only when tragedy struck that the full picture began to emerge. Psychologically, families often operate on unspoken hierarchies. Parents exert authority, children test boundaries, and siblings navigate relationships that are constantly shifting. The Reiners were no exception. Rob's authority, Michelle's mediation, Nick's independence, and Romy's observational role created a complex web of interactions. Each decision, each argument, each subtle gesture contributed to a larger dynamic that could influence behavior under stress. Experts in family psychology often point out that such dynamics are critical for understanding why conflicts escalate. What might appear as an isolated event is often the culmination of years of interaction, subtle power struggles, and unresolved emotional tension. The night of December 14th provides a stark illustration of how these dynamics can become catastrophic. The combination of proximity, psychological pressure, and unresolved tension created an environment in which violence could erupt. Romy's discovery of her parents' bodies was not only a personal trauma, but also a reflection of the broader failure of the household to manage these dynamics effectively. In retrospect, certain signs may have been visible to those within the family: small conflicts, subtle warnings, and hints of underlying stress, but they went unaddressed until it was too late. It's important to consider that tragedy in families is rarely the result of a single factor. In the Reiner household, multiple elements converged: emotional strain, family hierarchy, communication breakdowns, personality clashes, and the pressures of wealth and public image. Each factor alone might not have caused catastrophe, but together, they created conditions that allowed tragedy to occur. Understanding these dynamics is key not only to understanding the events of that night, but also to comprehending the broader narrative of human behavior under stress. As we continue to unravel the story, the Reiner family dynamics offer both context and insight. Nick's actions, Romy's awareness, and the parents' roles all intersect to form a complex psychological landscape. Each family member held both agency and vulnerability, and each contributed to a chain of events that culminated in tragedy. The night of December 14th was the moment when all these factors collided, producing a horror that was as much about human relationships as it was about crime. Yet, even with this understanding, questions remain. What exactly triggered the fatal events? Were there specific confrontations, warnings, or interactions that escalated tensions beyond control? Could intervention have prevented the tragedy, or was it inevitable given the psychological and emotional landscape of the household? These questions will continue to drive investigation, speculation, and analysis for years to come. The moment Romy Reiner stepped onto the estate that evening, the world she had known was about to shatter. For most people, returning home after a day away is a simple, comforting ritual. Unlock the door, hang up your coat, breathe in the familiar sense of home. But Romy's return on December 14th was anything but ordinary. Instead, it would become the defining moment of a nightmare that would grip not only her family but the entire nation. Romy had always been perceptive, the type of person who notices subtleties others overlook: the lingering tension in a conversation, the slight hesitation in a gesture, the way shadows stretch across a room just a little too long. It was likely this keen awareness that led her to be the first to sense that something was wrong. As she approached the main house, there was a silence that pressed against her ears, a quiet so heavy it seemed to absorb sound itself. At first, she might have thought it was just an unusual stillness, a calm night in a neighborhood that usually thrived on the subdued rhythms of wealth and comfort. But instinct told her otherwise. When she entered the house, the scene that greeted her was beyond comprehension. Her parents, Rob and Michelle Reiner, lay lifeless, victims of an act so brutal that it defied easy understanding. Official reports would later describe their deaths as the result of multiple sharp force injuries, with the manner of death classified as homicide. But in that moment, Romy was not thinking in forensic terms. She was thinking as a daughter, someone who had lost the people she loved most in the world, someone confronted with a reality so grotesque that even the strongest imagination could not have prepared her. The physical layout of the estate plays a chilling role in this story. The main house, expansive and meticulously maintained, is connected to the guest house where Nick lived. This proximity allowed for constant oversight, yet provided a degree of separation. It is within this spatial dynamic that Romy's discovery becomes so critical. She had to navigate through familiar corridors, places she had walked countless times, now transformed into a stage of horror. Every object, every shadow, every echo of the house's usual ambience was distorted by the presence of death. As she made her way to the scene, Romy quickly realized that this was not a robbery, a random act of violence, or a tragic accident. Something far darker had occurred, something intimately connected to the people who had shaped her life. Her initial shock quickly gave way to action. She called the authorities, her voice trembling but resolute. She informed them not only of what she had seen, but also of a critical observation, a warning about a dangerous family member. This detail would become pivotal, guiding investigators toward Nick, her brother, as the prime suspect. It is worth pausing to consider what it must have been like to make that call. Imagine holding a phone in your hand, dialing for help, while knowing that your words will carry the weight of both truth and suspicion. Romy was aware that she was implicating someone she loved, or at least someone within her own family. The courage and clarity required to make that call, in the midst of unimaginable trauma, speak to her character, her perception, and the gravity of the situation. Her warning was not casual. It was deliberate, informed by her understanding of the family dynamics and the potential threat. The first responders arrived swiftly, sirens slicing through the quiet of Brentwood as they navigated the estate's long driveways. Police officers, detectives, and forensic teams quickly took control of the scene, securing the area and beginning the painstaking work of documentation. For them, it was another homicide case, but the personal stakes were heightened by the family's prominence. The combination of high-profile victims and the involvement of a young family member made the investigation uniquely intense. Every detail mattered, from the positioning of the bodies to the traces of evidence left behind, to the statements provided by Romy. Romy's testimony became the cornerstone of the initial investigation. Her description of the scene, her observations about her parents, and her explicit warning about a dangerous family member helped law enforcement form the first outlines of a timeline and suspect profile. Without her clarity and bravery, the investigation might have faced critical delays, allowing speculation to run rampant unchecked. Her perspective, informed by an intimate understanding of family relationships and dynamics, provided a lens through which investigators could begin to interpret what had occurred. Beyond the immediate practicalities, Romy's discovery was emotionally devastating. Survivors of family homicide often describe a unique, piercing pain, a combination of grief, disbelief, and betrayal. The trauma of witnessing the aftermath of violence against one's own family members is distinct from other forms of loss. For Romy, this trauma was compounded by the suspicion that the perpetrator could be someone she knew intimately. The psychological weight of this realization cannot be overstated. The mix of grief, fear, and moral confusion forms a complex emotional landscape that she would have to navigate while cooperating with investigators and facing intense media scrutiny. The media quickly seized upon Romy's role in the unfolding tragedy. Headlines emphasized her discovery, her warning, and her emotional response, often framing her as both a witness and a symbolic figure of familial vigilance. Social media amplified this narrative, creating a dual-edged sword. On one hand, providing a platform for her story to be told. On the other, subjecting her to scrutiny, speculation, and judgment from a public eager for drama. Romy's position, caught between private grief and public attention, highlights one of the most challenging aspects of high-profile family tragedies, the interplay between personal trauma and societal fascination. Romy's awareness of danger also invites critical reflection. How much did she know before that night? Were there signs that she had observed over time, subtle behaviors, arguments, or emotional cues that indicated something was amiss? Family insiders hint at a complex web of interactions, some ordinary, some charged with tension, that may have signaled potential risk. Her decision to speak up, to alert authorities, demonstrates both insight and moral clarity, even under circumstances of extreme personal distress. As investigators continued their work, they relied heavily on Romy's initial observations. Her identification of a potentially dangerous family member provided a framework for questioning, evidence collection, and suspect evaluation. Nick Reiner, by virtue of his proximity and relationships, naturally became a central focus. The process of connecting her testimony with forensic evidence, behavioral analysis, and logistical details would take time, but Romy's role remained pivotal throughout the initial stages of the investigation. The discovery also set off a cascade of consequences that extended far beyond the immediate scene. Law enforcement began constructing a timeline of events, forensic teams cataloged evidence, and the Reiner family's private lives were thrust into the glare of public attention. Media coverage intensified, public speculation multiplied, and social media amplified every detail, rumor, and theory. Romy, as both witness and family member, became a symbol of the complexity inherent in familial tragedy. The intersection of grief, responsibility, and ethical decision-making in the most extreme circumstances. The emotional and psychological ramifications of her discovery cannot be overstated. Survivors of familial homicide often experience profound trauma, including feelings of guilt, confusion, and moral conflict. Romy's decision to report the scene, to highlight the potential danger of a family member, would undoubtedly weigh heavily on her conscience, even as it facilitated the critical early stages of the investigation. Her courage in that moment was instrumental, but it also came at immense personal cost. And yet, the story does not end with her discovery. What she found that night was only the beginning. The initial shock and horror gave way to the complex, ongoing unraveling of family relationships, legal proceedings, media scrutiny, and public fascination. Romy's discovery opened a door into a narrative that would explore human behavior, familial loyalty, betrayal, and the thin line between love and violence. Her role as witness, family member, and moral agent positioned her uniquely at the center of a tragedy that would continue to unfold for months and perhaps years. The sirens had barely faded when law enforcement descended upon the Reiner estate, and what unfolded next would become a meticulous, high-profile investigation that captured national attention. For the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, responding to a double homicide in a wealthy Brentwood neighborhood was routine in some ways. But the prominence of the victims, the shocking brutality of the crime, and the immediate implication of a family member elevated this case to a level few investigators ever experience. The weight of expectation, scrutiny, and public interest would define the investigation from its earliest moments. From the outset, authorities treated the Reiner estate as both a crime scene and a delicate psychological environment. The sprawling mansion, pristine gardens, and multiple structures, including the guest house where Nick Reiner lived, required careful navigation. Forensic teams moved methodically, photographing every angle, cataloging every item, and ensuring the integrity of the scene. Every blood spatter, every disturbed object, and every trace of evidence could provide clues to reconstruct the night of December 14th. The forensic process is painstaking, deliberate, and exacting. In a case where the suspect is a family member, it becomes even more crucial. Romy's immediate report was central to the initial phase of investigation. Her warning about a dangerous family member focused attention on Nick, the son living on the property. Detectives moved quickly, considering the logistics. He had access to the estate, knowledge of the household's routines, and proximity to the scene. While authorities are trained to remain objective, the combination of circumstantial factors made him the logical focal point for investigation. His arrest later that night reflected the necessity of controlling risk while ensuring the investigation could proceed without interference. In parallel, detectives began constructing a detailed timeline. What had Nick been doing in the hours leading up to the murders? Who had he interacted with? How did the events unfold in the main house versus the guest house? These questions were critical for establishing both motive and opportunity. Investigators also had to consider alternative scenarios. Was there an intruder? Was this premeditated or spontaneous? Could other family members or outside parties be involved? Every possibility had to be examined, verified, or eliminated through evidence. The forensic analysis was both comprehensive and revealing. Multiple sharp force injuries indicated extreme violence, suggesting a personal and emotionally charged act rather than a random attack. Forensic experts often note that the intensity and nature of the injuries can provide insight into the psychological state of the perpetrator, the sequence of events, and the dynamics of the struggle. In this case, the brutality pointed investigators towards someone with intimate knowledge of the household and direct access. reinforcing the suspicion surrounding Nick. Investigators also scrutinized the estate itself. The physical layout, main house, guest house, gates, driveways, and access points, offered clues to movement, timing, and opportunity. Security cameras, smart home devices, and other surveillance systems were examined for evidence. Every doorway, window, and hallway could yield critical insights. In high-profile cases like this, technology often plays a pivotal role, providing objective data that complements witness testimony and forensic evidence. Interviews were conducted meticulously. Romy provided her statement multiple times, offering details about what she observed, the condition of the scene, and her interactions leading up to the discovery. Neighbors were questioned, household staff were interviewed, and anyone with potential knowledge of the family's dynamics or recent interactions was contacted. Investigators sought to piece together a narrative that was both accurate and corroborated, balancing the need for thoroughness with sensitivity to the trauma experienced by those involved. Legal strategy began to intersect with investigative strategy almost immediately. Given the involvement of a family member as a suspect, law enforcement had to ensure that all procedures were beyond reproach. Evidence collection, chain of custody documentation, and arrest protocols had to withstand intense scrutiny. The consequences of procedural errors in a case of this magnitude could compromise the investigation and legal proceedings. Therefore, every step was executed with precision. Media coverage further complicated the investigation. Within hours of the murders, news outlets reported on the double homicide, Nick's arrest, and Romy's discovery. Social media amplified rumors, theories, and speculation, sometimes distorting facts or introducing conflicting narratives. Investigators had to remain disciplined, focusing on evidence and factual reporting rather than public perception. Yet, the media environment added pressure as families, neighbors, and law enforcement personnel navigated the intersection of tragedy and public spectacle. Behavioral analysis also became a key tool. Experts were consulted to understand potential motives, psychological profiles, and family dynamics that could explain the extreme violence. Profiling in familial homicides is complex, requiring careful examination of past interactions, personality traits, and relational patterns. In this case, the behavioral analysis intersected with physical evidence, witness testimony, and forensic data to form a multidimensional view of the situation. In the early stages, every detail mattered. The exact position of the bodies, the presence of defensive wounds, and the pattern of injuries were analyzed to reconstruct the events with precision. Investigators asked questions such as, was there a struggle? Did the victims attempt to defend themselves? Were there signs of premeditation, or was the attack spontaneous? Each answer helped narrow the timeline, identify critical evidence, and understand the sequence of events. Nick Reiner's arrest was not just procedural, it was strategic. Law enforcement needed to ensure he was secured while preserving the integrity of the investigation. The decision to charge him with 2 counts of first-degree murder reflected both the severity of the crime and the evidence, suggesting premeditation and personal involvement. During the initial interrogation, investigators sought clarity about his whereabouts, interactions, and mental state. While details of these sessions remain confidential, they form a critical part of the overall investigative picture. The Reiner estate, once a symbol of wealth and stability, became a central hub of forensic scrutiny. Every surface was examined for DNA, fingerprints, and other trace evidence. Experts reviewed the possibility of external involvement while also considering the psychological implications of a family member being the suspect. Each discovery had the potential to shift the narrative, reveal hidden motives, or confirm existing hypotheses. Public response added an additional layer of complexity. Neighbors, friends, and distant acquaintances offered insights, but also speculation, creating a mix of helpful and misleading information. Investigators had to separate rumor from fact, corroborate witness accounts, and rely on empirical evidence. In high-profile cases, the court of public opinion often rushes ahead of the actual investigation, creating pressure to maintain accuracy and discretion. Ultimately, the investigation into the Reiner murders combined traditional law enforcement methods with modern forensic science, psychological analysis, and careful legal strategy. It was an intricate operation, balancing urgency with precision, trauma management with evidence collection, and public scrutiny with professional discretion. Every move, every decision, every question asked in those initial hours would shape the trajectory of a case that captured the attention of a nation. But even as the investigation unfolded with careful precision, the next revelation would change everything, and no one saw it coming. In any high-profile homicide, evidence is everything. It is the backbone of investigation, the foundation upon which arrests are made, charges are filed, and ultimately, justice is sought. In the Reiner case, the forensic process became central to understanding what happened on that fateful night of December 14th. Every detail, no matter how small, had the potential to illuminate the path from tragedy to truth. And in this case, those details painted a disturbing, complex, and deeply personal story. The scene itself was immediately secured. The main house, where Rob and Michelle were found, became a controlled environment for investigators. Each room was carefully examined, every object cataloged and photographed. Blood spatter analysis, a crucial aspect of forensic science in violent crimes, revealed patterns that suggested both struggle and targeted attack. The multiple sharp force injuries inflicted on the victims indicated extreme violence, far beyond what could be classified as a random act. The nature of the wounds suggested a personal motive, a heightened emotional involvement that forensic experts often identify in familial homicides. Forensic teams began by mapping the entire scene. They measured distances, noted the placement of furniture, and documented entry points. In high-profile estates like the Reiner property, the complexity of the layout adds challenges. Multiple doors, windows, and passages must be accounted for, each a potential path of ingress or egress for a perpetrator. Investigators meticulously documented the guest house where Nick Reiner lived, considering both his access and the implications of his proximity to the crime scene. Every structural detail mattered. Fingerprints were collected from multiple surfaces throughout the main house and guest house. While natural in any forensic investigation, in a familial homicide these fingerprints can provide crucial confirmation of presence or absence in key areas. DNA samples were also collected, not only from the victims but from objects they interacted with, utensils, furniture, doors, and personal items. This allowed investigators to reconstruct interactions and potential points of conflict. The meticulous collection and preservation of DNA evidence would prove critical in connecting or excluding suspects as the investigation progressed. Another essential aspect of forensic analysis in this case was the study of defensive wounds. Autopsies revealed that both Rob and Michelle had attempted to defend themselves, their injuries consistent with efforts to shield vital areas or fend off an attacker. These details offer crucial insight into the sequence of events and the nature of the struggle. They suggest that the victims were aware of the threat and attempted to resist, implying a confrontation rather than a sudden, unnoticed attack. Each cut, bruise, and mark tells a story about fear, struggle, and the violent dynamics of that night. Blood spatter analysis also provided critical context. The patterns of blood droplets, the angles of impact, and the distribution of stains across floors and walls allowed experts to reconstruct movements and actions during the attack. In many cases, this analysis can indicate the number of assailants, the type of weapon used, and the sequence in which injuries were inflicted. In the Reiner case, these patterns suggested that the violence was concentrated and targeted, consistent with a personal, emotionally charged confrontation rather than random aggression. Investigators also examined the weapons themselves. Sharp force injuries indicated knives or similar implements, and forensic teams searched for any objects that might have been used in the attack. Weapon recovery, testing, and analysis are vital in establishing both cause of death and potential links to a suspect. If a weapon is traced to a specific location, individual, or purchase, it can provide a critical connection in proving culpability. Digital forensics became another key avenue of investigation. Smart home devices, surveillance cameras, and other electronic records provided timestamps, movement data, and potential audio or video evidence. These technologies allow investigators to establish timelines with remarkable accuracy. In the Reiner estate, where advanced home security systems were likely in place. Such evidence could corroborate witness statements, identify movements within the property, and clarify interactions between individuals in the hours leading up to the murders. Investigators also examined behavioral patterns and potential motive indicators. While forensics primarily focuses on physical evidence, in high-profile cases like this, psychological profiling often intersects with the physical evidence. Behavioral patterns, familial relationships, and observed tensions are evaluated alongside DNA, fingerprints, and wound analysis. In cases where the suspect is a family member, understanding relational dynamics is essential for interpreting the significance of the physical evidence. Forensic pathologists provided detailed reports on both victims, confirming cause of death, estimating time of death, and noting the intensity and nature of injuries. These reports were critical in establishing the timeline and understanding the lethality of the attack. The precision of these analyses allows investigators to differentiate between initial blows and subsequent injuries, providing insight into the flow of the violent encounter. In addition, forensic experts examine the possibility of premeditation. The location and concentration of injuries, coupled with the timing of events and access to the victims, suggested that the attack may have been planned rather than spontaneous.